Good evening. In this week's Parsha, Parshas Bahar, the Torah discusses the following case of a Jew who becomes impoverished, a Jew who becomes impoverished, who is very poor, and out of desperation he has to sell himself as a slave, as a servant, in order to be able to make some money, perhaps to support his wife and children, or to support himself. He cannot support himself. So he sells himself as a servant, working for somebody else in order to be able to support himself. And then the Torah discusses a case where he becomes so impoverished, he has no choice but to sell himself as a slave to a non-Jew. And this is in the days in Eretz Yisrael when Jubilee was being practiced, the laws of Yovel. Once in 50 years there was a special sabbatical year, and every piece of land that was sold during the 50-year period went back to its original owner. And every slave was liberated automatically. This applied when the laws of slavery applied in the time of Jubilee, in the time of Yovel, which according to most opinions ceased once the 10 tribes were exiled from the Holy Land, because for Yovel to be practiced halachically, you need most of the tribes living in the land of Israel. So this Jew is impoverished and he sells himself to a non-Jew living in Eretz Yisrael. Furthermore, in non-Jews there can be different categories. Either he sells himself to a Ger Teishav, which is a Gentile who observes the 7 Noachide laws, or he sells himself to Mishpachas Ger, to the family of a Gentile which is alien from Jewish morality, in other words, a family of idolatry. Or more, Eker Mishpachas Ger, the Pasuk says. He sells himself to the idol itself, which means he is so desperate to make a living, to feed himself, that he sells himself for the idolatry. If there's an organization or an institution or a temple of idolatry, he sells himself to that institution, working for it. He doesn't worship the idol, as Rashi explains, but he chops wood, he draws water, he takes care of different things, all to service this institution of idolatry. What should happen? So the Torah says, after he sold himself, it is a mitzvah that his relatives should redeem him. They should come to the buyer and say, here, take back the money that you spent, that you gave in order to purchase him as a servant, and let him go free. Let this person be set free. If a few years passed already, so then obviously they don't have to pay him the full price that he paid. Rather, as the Torah specifies, is they make a calculation how much time is left till Yovel, when he's anyway going to be free, and according to that they make the financial calculation and they pay up the buyer the money that he lost. They compensate him for the slave, and the slave is set free. The Torah says, Echad me echav yigalenu, one of his brothers should redeem him, or his uncle, or his cousin, or any other relative from his family, or if his own means become sufficient, he shall redeem himself. So first, one of his brothers, Doida, his uncle, his father's brother, or Ben Doida, his uncle's son, his first cousin, or any other relative, first cousin once removed, second cousin, third cousin, and then he siga yada, if his means become sufficient, he redeems himself. If he gets a Yerusha, he gets some type of estate or some type of money or a gift, let him go to the buyer and redeem himself, give back the money, and be set free. That's the law, one of the laws in Parshas Bahar. And here there are two questions. The famous Teres Koyanim on this pasuk, Rambam Hilchas Avodim, Gemara in Kiddushin Daf Chaf Aleph, and Rashi there explain that the way the Torah enumerates the order of the relatives that should redeem him is not just random, rather it's meticulous. HaKarev Karev Koidem, which means the closer the relative, the more the obligation on him to redeem the relative. Thus, the first relative that's enumerated is a brother. A brother is the closest relative, it's a sibling. The first one who's obliged to redeem the person in slavery is his brother. Next, after the brother, comes an uncle, his father's brother. Next, after that, is his father's brother's son or his father's sister's son, which is a first cousin. After that comes any relative of the family. So, kol hakarev karev koidim, the Torah doesn't just specify different relatives, it's part of the law. Whoever is closer in blood is first obligated to redeem. So the obligation rests first on the person who's closer. And then if this person, there's no brother, or he's not alive, or he can't do it, he doesn't have the financial means, then the obligation continues to the next closest relative, and then to the next closest relative, and then to any relative as far as he is. And that's the halach. If this is the case, there's a tremendous question. His brother we have, his uncle, his first cousin, any relative, and then himself. Himself should be the first. If kol hakarev karev koidim, whoever is closest in blood, is obligated first and foremost to redeem him, certainly the obligation is first on himself. If you have the money, get out of there. And yet himself, the Torah says at the end, after a brother and an uncle and a first cousin and relative, and if you have the money, you do it yourself. That should be first. Adam karev eitzel, you're closer to yourself more than your brother, more than your uncle, more than your first cousin. And yet this only comes at the end. So if this is how the system of the pasuk would have been written, fine. But you see clearly, kol hakarev karev koidim. The first karev is he himself. And Taka, if you look in Rambam, Hilchos Avodim, Perek Beis, what does the Rambam say on this case? Im loi siga yadei ligoil kroiv of poidinais. If he himself has insufficient financial means to redeem himself, then his relatives are obligated to redeem him. But if he has the money in the bank to redeem himself after he sold himself to a Gentile as a slave, the obligation first and foremost is imposed upon he himself as a Jew to liberate himself. And yet, in Chumash, this is the last option. Which brings us to the next question. We have his brother, we have his uncle, we have his first cousin, we have any relative, we have himself. What about his father? His father comes before his uncle. His father even comes before his brother. You have a sibling and you have a dad. Who should redeem you first? Your father. The Torah makes no mention of father. So you may say the Torah is not speaking about a generation above, but it is, your uncle. What's the yichus of your uncle? Your father's brother. Talk about a father first. We talk about your brother, we talk about your uncle, we talk about your uncle's child. What about your own father? It's not mentioned. And it's obvious that the father comes before the brother in halacha as well. If a person passes away, God forbid, and there's no children to inherit the estate of this person, if there is a father alive and there are brothers, the father comes first. Ha'av koidem lach, and that's the halacha. And yet father here is totally not mentioned. Why not? So he himself comes at the end, and his father is totally not mentioned. You can of course also ask another question. Why don't we mention his child? His child should redeem him. Before his brothers come a child. This is, however, not a strong question because it's not part of the natural circumstances that the child that he has to support should be able to redeem him. If the child has financial means initially, so we have to say it's a child who saw his father being sold into slavery and yet did not bother to give his father money not to be sold into slavery. That's a little bit problematic to assume. Number one, it's problematic to assume that we're dealing with a situation that the child is wealthier than the father. Usually the reason the father is selling himself into slavery is because he has to support his own family. So we understand why the Torah doesn't mention a child, although it's possible that he's a man and he has a child who's an adult and the child makes money afterwards, so the child should redeem him. But under normal circumstances, that's not the case. But the father, why is the father not mentioned? If the uncle is mentioned, if the brother is mentioned, his father might also have the means. A similar question is asked in one more place in Chumash. in Parshas Pinchas, the Torah discusses the laws of Yerusha, of inheritance, after the passing of somebody. So the Torah says that if somebody passes away and there's no son, the inheritance should go to the daughter. If there's no daughter, it should go to his brothers. If he has no brothers, it should go to his uncles, his father's brothers. And if they don't exist, it should go to his closest kin, his closest relative. Here again, no father mentioned. A son, a daughter, brothers, uncles, and closest kin. His own father is not mentioned in the laws of Yerusha. Although halachically the rabbis deduced in the Rav that the father comes before the brothers, if a man passes away or a woman passes away, there's no children. The father, the parent, comes before the siblings to inherit. In the pasuk it's not mentioned, just like here in Bahar. We start with a brother, with an uncle, with a cousin, just like in Pinchas. We start with a son and a daughter and a brother and an uncle and any relative, and the father is not mentioned. So the Ramban, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman Nachmanides, and Rabbeinu Bechaya in Parshas Pinchas explain derech bracha yedaber v'lo b'nechras. The Torah doesn't want to mention a cursed situation where, God forbid, a child passes away in the life of the father. So the father is not mentioned because the Torah doesn't want to describe a situation where somebody died and their parent is still alive, or their parents are still alive, which is a tragedy beyond tragedy. So the Torah specifies a case where there may be no children, but there's brothers, there's an uncle, and there are other relatives, not a father. This is the Ramban's answer by Yerusha. But first of all, this answer itself is somewhat problematic. Number one, this is a question of halacha. It's not a question of emotion. It's a question of law. So why would the Torah not describe to us the halacha that the father comes before the brothers? True, it's not a blessing. God forbid, it's a tragedy beyond a tragedy that the father had to bury his child. But halachically, we need to know that the father inherits the inheritance of the child before the siblings. Especially the mission may give us the wrong message, that a father is not a Yerush, a father doesn't inherit. Especially the fact that the person died without children is also not a blessing. It's also a double tragedy. And yet the Torah specifies that case. Why? Because it's halachically important to know what do we do from a Torah perspective under these tragic circumstances when a man dies childless. So we should also understand what do we do when the man dies childless, but he still has a father. But the Ramban and Rabbeinu Bechaya give that answer over there in Parshas Pinchas. Whether we like that answer, we have difficulty with that answer, doesn't answer the question here in Parshas Bahar. Here we're not talking about death. We're talking about a child, a person who was so impoverished that he sold himself as a slave to a non-Jew, and there's an obligation on his relatives to redeem him, to set him free. And the first obligation is on himself, if he can, if he can't, on his father. The Torah omits the father and will not mention the case of the father. Why not? At the Farbrengen of Shabbos Parshas Bahar B'Chukoisai Tovshin Chav Gimel, 1963 of this Shabbos, the Rebbe at his Shabbos Farbrengen dedicated the first Sikha, the first talk of the Farbrengen, to present an explanation on these questions. Part of the Sikha was later published in Likutei Sichos, volume 17, Chelik Yud Zayin Parshas Bahar, and some of the points of that Sikha, of that talk, we will present this evening. The explanation, the possible explanation in these questions. Question number one, why doesn't he come first? Why is he himself specified last? And question number two, why is his father not mentioned? Could be explained based on what the Gemara says in Kiddushin Daf Chaf. And Rashi brings it here at the end of Parshas Bahar, that the structure of our week's Parsha is not random, but it rather represents an evolution, a domino effect from bad to worse, to yet worse, and yet worse. The beginning of the Parsha deals with Shemitah, with sabbatical, the sabbatical year, which is actually this year, Tavshin Samach Ches, is a Shemitah year, once in 7 years, when there's an obligation that the land in Eretz Yisrael experiences Shabbos, rest and tranquility. No working, no agricultural work in farms or fields or orchards or gardens in Eretz Yisrael. And whatever does grow on its own is hefker, is open. One can do business with it and sell it. One can use it for eating themselves and their family and their animals. But it also has to be open to the public. Anybody could walk in and eat from the field. Even animals, as the Torah says in Parshas Bahar. What happens when a person does not observe the halachos of Shviyas? So Parshas Bahar continues with a situation when a person sells mobile property. When a person sells monetary things of monetary value, it's not a random connection. It's from bad, it became worse. They didn't observe Shemitah, they tried to make another few dollars, and ultimately they have to end up selling something that's precious to them. And then Rashi continues from there. It gets even worse, and the person is forced not only to sell something mobile, but also to sell a field, real estate. And then the Torah continues about selling a home. That if the person still did not do tshuva, deteriorates further, ultimately, he has to end up selling not only a field or another form of real estate, but his own home where he lives. And when he sells his home, the next stage in Parshas Bahar is a prohibition against lending with interest. The person is desperate for money, so he needs a loan, so he starts borrowing money for interest. So not only did he sell things that really belonged to him, so at least he's making money from something he owned, now he's already borrowing money with interest. And the interest, as Rashi says, bites into a person. That's why it's called neshech. It bites into a person, he says, like a snake. Initially, one doesn't feel the poison, the venom of the bite, but before he knows it, the toxic effect of the poison spreads in the body and kills the person. And the same is true with interest. People who deal with a lot of interest on financial interest know in the beginning it's a little bit, and it grows and grows and grows like a monster, disproportionately till it can overwhelm a person's life. So this is an evolution of a person's degradation from one level to a lower level to another level. It started off with not keeping Shemitah sabbatically. And then it ended up they have to sell a few items and then real estate and then a home, and then he's now borrowing with interest. And Rashi continues from the Gemara in Kedushin. After this, what happens in Parshas Bahar? He sells himself. If he still did not do tshuva, ultimately he's forced to sell himself to another Jew. And if he still did not do tshuva, he's forced not only to sell himself to another Jew, he sells himself to a Gentile. And not only to a Gentile, it could be a Gentile who's an idol worshiper. And then the worst, he sells himself for idolatry itself, to serve, to do service for the idolatry. Although he doesn't worship it, then there's no mitzvah to redeem him, as the Maskil David explains in Rashi, but he does jobs for this idol, and this is the place that he reaches. Everybody understands that we're not discussing here only a financial evolution from bad to worse. That's on one level. The finances. He has to sell precious items and real estate and a home and borrow interest and sell himself. But the financial digression, the financial tragedy that is enveloping this person is symptomatic of a psychological and spiritual and emotional tragedy. As Rashi makes it clear, the person spiritually has fallen low and becomes lower and lower. If we can apply it in more contemporary psychological terms, we're dealing here with a classical case of addiction. Addiction does not begin in a grandiose fashion, overwhelming a human being day one. Somebody who is addicted to gambling, or who is addicted to nicotine, or who is addicted to alcohol, or who is addicted to promiscuous relationships. In the beginning, they do not realize how it overwhelms their life, how it poisons their lives. They're going to have a little fun. They're going to release stress. They're going to be able to give themselves a little vacation from the misery and agony that simmers in their heart. But sooner than later, or later than sooner, but ultimately, they begin losing hold of their life. Their core is gone, and as happens often we see with addicts, and it's tragic, but it's ma'asim b'chol yom, people who have a little experience with this, whether with helping people or people who know it from their own life or their loved ones' lives. No, it's exactly how Rashi puts it from Masechta Kedushin Daf Chav. First, you're only selling a few items in your house, and then you're selling precious real estate. Maybe today's market, I shouldn't say precious, but real estate is precious. What ends up happening is the person loses his home. His own home where his wife and children live, that's what he loses. And it's not enough. Now he's borrowing money with interest, so he becomes an absolute financial slave, overwhelmed day and night, but he's not in control. And then he has to sell himself, which means he himself becomes destroyed in various forms, often losing his wife, losing his children, losing his loved ones, and ending up in the streets. This is not an exaggeration and a dramatic description, as I said. Anyone who knows a little bit of what's happening in the world of addiction today knows how unfortunate the facts and the reality is and how many cases there are. But the addict himself or herself is unaware of it initially. Initially, I'm having fun. What do you care? I have a stressful life. I have a stressful marriage. My relationship is really sour. I don't like myself. I have old issues. I need an outlet. I need a way to express myself. The challenge is that the person has no father. And that's why father is not mentioned here. This is what the Rebbe explained. The father is not mentioned as a person who is capable of redeeming the individual, because although physically the case may be of such where there is a father, but psychologically, spiritually, and emotionally, as you know, every halacha in Chumash and Torah Sheb'Ksav is not just a practical halacha, a concrete case. The physical case, the physical scenario is a symptom, it's a manifestation of deeper layers of experience, layer beneath layer. There's Pshat and Remez and Drush Sod, there's the Pasuk in Asiya and in Yitzirah and in Bria and in Atzilus, on various levels, and even within the Asiya itself, it exists on a financial level, on a psychological level, on an emotional level, on a spiritual level. And the Torah is telling us here that there's no father. That's number one. And number two, the Torah begins as the Redeemer, not himself. His brother, his uncle, his first cousin, another relative, and then himself. Now we will understand. The greatest tragedy and truth about addiction is people are incapable of helping themselves, which they will deny till the last moment, because it's very difficult emotionally to really believe that you absolutely have no control over your life, but this is the case. The case is you absolutely do not have control over your life, and this is the difference between an addict and not an addict. Every person, I shouldn't say, most people play with ugly thoughts. Most people have thoughts and cravings and ambitions and dreams that if they would articulate it verbally to other people, it would be extremely awkward and uncomfortable, because these are the demons and the skeletons and the secrets that we play around with in our imagination, in our conscious, in our subconscious, in our subconscious, and it sometimes comes to the surface. But there's a difference between that and behavior. This is the distinction between a person who's accountable for their life, who's responsible for their life, who has their life together, and somebody whose life is disintegrated. The difference is everyone deals with different thoughts. And many people have to deal with grotesque instincts, or repulsive cravings, or promiscuous dispositions, and so forth. but it remains intact. It remains where it is. The person knows how to identify it, how to keep it confined to what it is, but to live a moral and ethical, responsible and godly life, a good life. Then there is a certain point in human life where he loses it. And it may not happen suddenly, but there's no core anymore stopping, creating red borders, red lines that are not crossed. Everything is crossed. It comes to a promiscuous relationship. The person doesn't think twice. His body is craving it. He's lonely. He's miserable. He's depressed. He's bored. His marriage is not good. He goes. The same is true with gambling and with alcohol and with all other types of addictions that exist. Some addictions are very subtle and some addictions are very crass. Some addictions are spiritual and some addictions are very physical. But addiction is addiction. There are lines that are crossed. There are no borders and barriers that prevent them from crossing a certain line. The person's life becomes chaotic. The core is missing, and they allow alien forces and instincts to overwhelm them, and they go to places where they fall down very low. They are not in control. So the Torah doesn't start with you saving yourself. You can't save yourself at this point. Sure, you may have the money in the bank to redeem yourself, but on a psychological level, on an emotional level, on a spiritual level, salvation will only come from outside of you. Which means that the person has to surrender. The person has to acknowledge to themselves that they are hopeless. Not hopeless in the negative sense, therefore let them do it more. Hopeless, they need God in their life. They need a brother in their life. They need an uncle in their life. They need a cousin in their life. They need another human being to be able to be there for them. They need a higher power. They need God Himself, Hashem, to help them get out of their dirt, get out of their mess, because they themselves are incapable of self-control. Sure, they wake up one day in a good mood. Sure, we are a giant step forward does not necessarily mean the step forward is not into the abyss. So when a moment of pressure comes, they fall right back into the abyss. And again, this occurs in many a life on a constant basis in many a community. Religious communities, secular communities, Jewish communities and non-Jewish communities. So the Torah does not begin with you helping yourself. You really need outside help. Unfortunately, it reached that point. You cannot rely on yourself. You cannot trust yourself. You need to surrender, acknowledge that I have no power to deal with it. And I give up my power to the higher power, to the divine power, to help me out. How does it begin? There's no father in a person's life. And when we say there's no father, it's on two levels. Number one, psychologically, this is a very common case. Addiction is breeded by the fact that the person is craving for a father that they never had. They may have had a physical father, but not an emotional father. They may have not had a physical father, unfortunately. But the father figure represents in life a certain solidity, a certain confidence, a certain strength to deal with stress, to deal with tumultuousness. There's no father. There may be brothers, there may be uncles, there may be cousins, but the person did not have a father in life. Let's take it now to the spiritual level. And remember, the psychology is always a symptom of the spiritual. They're very much interconnected and interwoven. So we all know, the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, that people become alienated from their souls when their father is not functioning in their life. The father represents in Tanya chapter 18, chapter 19, the level we call Chachma Shebenefesh, the spark of wisdom in the soul, which is that component of the Jewish soul that senses its relationship with God in a very real and authentic way. When the Jew becomes alienated from his or her father, when we have no father in our life, whether it's our physical father or a metaphysical father, God, we have no core, we have no epicenter, we have no quintessence upon which we hold on to. The person often is lost, craving to fill a void and an emptiness that is desperately seeking for gratification. Desperately seeking gratification. Spiritually speaking, the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya that although every single Jew has a very deep relationship with their Father in heaven, with God, but sometimes that fuse, that level of the relationship is asleep. And since it's asleep, the Jew does not feel it consciously. And since he doesn't feel it consciously, he can allow his life to go haywire. And he can allow his wife to become alienated from God because he or she is not consciously aware of how deep and how meaningful the relationship is. When the person loses everything, or when something in life shakes up the person very profoundly, suddenly the deeper component of the self wakes up, and when it wakes up and they feel their Father inside, they become transformed. As the Alter Rebbe says, historically there were Jews who couldn't care less about Judaism. If you would ask them, what is your perspective on religion, on God? I'm not religious, I'm not even sure I believe. I don't care, I'm apathetic, I'm indifferent. And yet, when it came a point that these people were asked, if you want to live, give up your Jewishness. If you don't give up your Jewishness, you're going to die. If you identify with the Jewish people, if you fight with the Jewish people, if you're Jewish, you're going to die. If you detach from the Jewish people, you will live. Historically speaking, we have seen again and again that a certain fuse is pushed in the soul of the Jew, and even the most secular, so-called secular or alien or apathetic or indifferent Jew was ready to die rather than to give up his or her identity as a Jew. And the question is why? If he or she dedicated their life to Jewishness, great rabbis, tzaddikim, Kabbalists, mystics, okay, I understand. Socrates died for his faith too, and many others. But here were Jews who spent a lifetime in sin, spent a lifetime that was alien, but a certain fuse was pushed, and they were holier than the holiest. Why? So the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, this phenomenon that the Father in them, the Chachma Shebenefesh, that relationship with God, which is at the core of the soul of the Jew, is asleep. But when it wakes up and it sends its message into the human psyche, into the Jewish brain, it sends shockwaves that the whole consciousness is transformed, and suddenly a person sees who he is or who she is for real, and it's very clear that they cannot be who they are not. They are Jewish, this is who they are, they can't deny it even if they want to. It's almost, he says, sometimes they may want to live, but they can't because they can't be who they're not. This is who they are. It's almost like they don't have a choice often. This explains, according to Chassidus, why both in the portion of inheritance and in this week's portion, the Father is not mentioned. Physical death in Torah doesn't only talk about physical death, it also talks about spiritual death. And spiritual death comes from the fact that there's no father in the person's life. The father is asleep, as the Gemara says, sleep is a 60th of death. When the father is present and alive, the person is alive, spiritually speaking. And the same is true in this case. What allows the Jew to deteriorate is there's no father to redeem him. If there was a present father in his life, he would not reach this level. this is in the negative. Now let's go to the positive. The Torah says, Geula tiyaloi. This person could be redeemed, should be redeemed. Not just financially, spiritually, which means even when you're listening to this and you're thinking about it and you consider yourself an addict, and you may be an addict, the Torah says, Geula tiyaloi. There is much hope, there is redemption. The greatest tragedy in life is when you stop believing in the possibility to redeem yourself. When you give up hope for redemption, when you fall into the abyss and into the despair, and you allow your wacky thoughts and your grotesque instincts and your promiscuous cravings to run their course without having the deep dignity and knowledge that redemption is around the corner. Geula tiyaloi, redemption is possible. And the Torah says, why is redemption possible? The Torah says, the relatives should redeem him, and if they don't redeem him, Yovel is going to redeem him. The 50th year. Why? Ki libnei Yisrael avad. Jews are my slaves. Avadaiheim. They are my slaves. So Rashi, Avadaiheim, they're my slaves. Shtari koidim. My contract came first before the Gentiles' contract. True! Somebody else signed a contract with them. They sold themselves into slavery. But my contract precedes that contract. And thus, when the year of Jubilee comes and my contract rears its head, they go out. They're set free because my contract comes first. This is not a financial statement alone. It's a spiritual / psychological statement, which means when the Torah was given, every Jew was transformed into an Eved Hashem. You're a slave to an addiction, you're a slave to somebody else, true. But underlying all your layers of slavery, at the core of your soul, you're in a commitment, you're in a relationship with God. Shtari koidem. My contract precedes your contract, which means underlying all your dirt, you're a free human being, chosen by a free God to be in a free relationship with Him. Because the definition of serving God means to serve God with freedom, which is why God gave every person free choice and tells the person, you do what you do, because you will choose what you want to do. I ask you, I suggest you, I explain to you, I show you the consequences, but you have to choose the relationship. It's about your choice. Whether you're going to live with your reality or you're going to alienate your reality. So the Yerushalmi says, we spoke about this in Parshas Va'era, that a slave is not let us say Kriya Shema. Why? Because Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. God is our God. God is one. A slave has another God. In other words, the definition of Avodas Hashem, of serving the real God, means that you have no other gods in your life. No other gods means you're not addicted to any particular format, any particular structure. You're committed to serve a God who has no structure, who has no definition, who always challenges any type of structure to go higher and higher and deeper and deeper. So, Shtari Koida, my contract comes before you. And nobody can take away from you that beneath your addictions and subjugation, there is a soul that's untouchable. There's a soul that has an infinite power connected to an infinite God, which is not confined by any particular habit or instinct, because that's the definition of the Jewish God. Thus, even your greatest addictions are a layer that is additional to your essence. There's an essence that's beyond it. And thus, redemption is possible. Either redemption will come Jubilee. Jubilee means once in 50 years there will be a moment of truth in your life. You may have hit rock bottom or something else, and God's contract with you will be revealed. Or you will have people in your life or forces in your life that will redeem you, because you cannot do it yourself. The Gemara says in Brachas Daf, a prisoner cannot liberate himself from incarceration. He must have people who are objective, who are not part of the problem, to help him get out of the addiction. Which is one of the things we see in addiction too, that often family members and relatives become enablers. They are desperately trying to save the person. Instead of saving them, they help them continue their addiction by feeding into them, by believing their lies, by compromising their own needs, by allowing the person to get away with murder in the name of pity and compassion and empathy, and they allow the addiction to erode everything until the person loses everything, not understanding that he is not in control of himself. But the objective is not that the person should always remain dependent on a brother, on an uncle, on a cousin, on a relative. After this, the Torah says, or if you have your own means to redeem yourself. Just like it's financially, the greatest help you can give a person is not just give them money, but give them enough money and give them the dignity and the encouragement that they themselves should be able to generate their own money. And the same is true also psychologically and emotionally and spiritually. The great objective of helping a person is not just always helping them and helping them and helping them and just having them surrender and surrender, but rather to ultimately give them the strength and the perspective on the means that they become truly independent. Because salvation from addiction could become another form of addiction. It can become a form of codependence. You become dependent on people. You're now intoxicated by certain individuals. It's ultimately about you finding the means within yourself to liberate yourself. And when the person does that, Geula Tiyaloi, then redemption is possible. And this is the answer to both questions that we began. Question number one, if Kol HaKarev, Karev Koidim, why doesn't the Torah begin with he himself? And question number two, why is the father not mentioned? Both of these questions are answered because the whole possibility of this situation came because of the absence of a father, whether psychologically or spiritually. And as a result of the situation, the person is incapable on his own to begin redemption. He must surrender to the higher force. He must surrender to Hashem, and he must reach out to the help of people who are outside of him to schlep him out of the abyss, and to allow him to connect to Shtari Koidim, to the contract that preceded any other contract, which is a pure, untouchable relationship with a free God who wanted free human beings to build a relationship with a God who cannot be defined or confined to any particular habit or addiction or instinct and so forth. Conclude with a story that they say about the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov used to daven for a long time. And there was an alcoholic who would come into shul every day to witness the Baal Shem Tov's prayers. Sometimes the prayers continued for 3 or 4 hours, and this alcoholic would be there throughout. Following the prayers, he would go to the local bar or a nearby bar and get smashed, intoxicated for the rest of the day. The next day he came back to the Baal Shem Tov's davening. And they once asked him, you're a drunk, why do you come to the Baal Shem Tov's davening? An alcoholic he was, and an addict he was, but sensitive he was too, which is the case in so many addicts. It begins from the fact that they're very sensitive people. And because they're very sensitive, and because they have a spiritual touch, life gets to them in a very deep place. And their troubles get to them in a very deep place. And instead of dealing with it in a holistic and healthy way, they revert to dramatic and radical solutions for their life. So back to our story, a sensitive person he was, and depth he had, but an addict he was. So he told them, he said, I have a craving for alcohol. But as deep and as powerful as my craving is, it's limited, it's finite. Everything that's human is finite. You can have the greatest craving in the world, you know it when you fulfill the craving. Okay, next. You always have to raise the bar higher and higher and higher, because what satisfied you last year doesn't do the trick today. Today you need more tension. Today you need more misery. Today you need more excitement. Every craving of a human being is ultimately limited, even if it's very powerful and destructive. So he said, I have a craving for alcohol, but it's the same craving every day. I need it. I'm desperately looking for it, but I'm bored with it. He's like, come to the Baal Shem Tov's davening. Here I experience infinity. Here I experience an energy of infinity, of bli gvul, of Ein Sof. Now my craving takes on another dimension. When I go to drink, it satisfies such a powerful craving that this is my true joy in life. What was he doing essentially? He was stealing. He was borrowing. He was using the Baal Shem Tov's energy of davening, which was an infinite energy because it was fueled by his relationship with God, who's infinite. And it was fueled by the Baal Shem Tov's soul, which is infinite. So he was manipulating and using and depleting for himself, using that energy, and distorting it within himself so that it could satisfy his addiction. But this also means that beneath the distortion is hope. Because Shtari Kaidem, my contract, Hashem says, preceded your contract. And since it preceded your contract, if you create a contract with me, God says, redemption is possible. Because beneath all of your addictions and contracts, Shtari Kaidem, there is one innocent and pure contract that is more powerful and more infinite and deeper than all of your superficial addictions and contracts, as powerful as they seem. Have a wonderful evening.